Hey everybody, welcome to Outliers. I'm Molly Hawkins, and today we will be talking about how athletes are pushing the boundaries of human performance through a heightened state of decision-making, which has been dubbed flow by author of soon-to-be-released Rise of Superman. Today I have Steven Kotler on. He's a New York Times best-selling author, journalist, scientist, co-founder of the Flow Genome Project, and as well the Rancho de Chihuahua Dog Sanctuary. Welcome to Outliers, Steven.
Molly, thanks for having me.
Hi. So you have quite the LinkedIn profile.
That's where you're going to get your information.
Nah, just kidding. I did some Googling. Don't worry. I found you on Facebook, too. You're pretty easy to find.
Yeah, I don't hide.
You've got a lot going on right now.
I am busy.
So before we dig into all the meaty stuff that I'm most excited about, maybe you could tell us a little bit about you. Who are you? How did you go from getting a degree in English and creative writing to developing this platform, this way of thinking of this a game-changing way of looking at what makes the greats great? How did you go from A to B?
So I was a journalist. I basically came out of college and, was a punk rock kid, and nobody would hire me because I looked funny. All I was looking for was a way. I started as a novelist, and I was looking for a way to pay my bills, and I became a journalist. And still work as a journalist sometimes. But when I was 30 years old, I got Lyme disease and spent the better portion of 3 years in bed. Very, very, very sick. Could barely move, horrible pain, loss of brain function, couldn't think, had no short-term memory, had no long-term memory, was just beyond gone. And the doctors didn't know what to do with me. They had run out of medicine to put me on, and I was getting worse, and there was really, nothing anybody could do for me. And I was pretty honestly suicidal because I could work and be clear-headed and function maybe 10% of the time, and all I knew I was going to be was a burden to my friends and family going forward. And when I was kind of really seriously thinking about killing myself, a friend shows up at my front door and says, "We're going surfing." And I just started laughing because I couldn't walk across a room, let alone go surfing. And she was an absolute pain in my ass. And after a couple hours, I figured, okay, what's the worst that could happen? We'll go surfing. She took me to, drove me to Sunset Beach, which is just about the wimpiest beginner wave in the world. It was a tiny day. They gave me a board the size of a Cadillac. They had to help me out to the break. Literally, I was walked out to the break and put on the board. A couple seconds later, a wave came, and sort of muscle memory took over. I mean, I hadn't surfed in years at that point, and spun the board around twice, spun the board around, paddled a couple times, popped up, was on my feet, and I popped up into another dimension. Time seemed to slow down. My senses were incredibly heightened. All these very strange things were going on, and I felt great. I mean, I felt better than I had felt in years, and I felt alive for the first time. And I felt so good. I caught 4 more waves that day, and I was totally disassembled by the end of it. They drove me home, put me in bed for a couple of weeks, and people had to bring me food for a couple of weeks because I was too weak to get out of bed. And on about the 15th day, I went back to the ocean and went surfing again. And slowly, over about 6 months, I went from about 10% functionality to about 80% functionality. And the first question was, what the hell just happened to me? How is that possible? How is surfing a cure for a chronic autoimmune disease? Worse of which, I've got a science background. I'm trained kind of as a science writer, and I don't have mystical experiences. Things like that don't happen to me. So I thought I was starting to lose my mind. Lyme is fatal if it gets into your brain. I thought that was what was going on. So why was I having these quasi-mystical experiences, and what the hell was going on with my health? The quest to answer those questions led me deep into flow state research. And by the way, flow is not my term. It belongs to the term was coined by former University of Chicago chairman of the psychology department, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And he was looking at a phenomenon that really the research on this dates back to the 1870s, but we define flow, so we can just kind of get this definition out of the way, and we can talk about it a little bit more. Flow is an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and perform our best. So in flow, focus tightens incredibly, laser-focused attention. Action and awareness start to merge. Time dilates, so it slows down, like you get that freeze frame in a car crash effect, or it speeds up and 5 hours pass by in like 5 minutes. Your sense of self, your sense of self-consciousness, they disappear completely. And throughout, performance goes through the roof. Now, the experience gets its name from the sensation conferred. In flow, every action, every decision leads fluidly, seamlessly to the next. So flow feels flowy, and that's where the term comes from. And now, there's lots of other things we can kind of add onto what it is, but that's the kind of shorthand, quick definition. And I basically, traced my experience with Lyme and surfing into flow state research, and it kind of, one thing led to another, and 15 years later, I'm running a research organization.
So that's kind of how it all unfolded for you, and you had that experience, and then you decided to dig deeper and turned into the Flow Genome Project?
Yep.
Okay. Can you tell people a little bit more about the Flow Genome
Sure.
Project?
One of the things I discovered as I was, doing more and more flow research is there were tons of people studying this, but they were all totally balkanized. So the guys who were working on neuroelectricity were not talking to the women who were working on neurochemistry, weren't talking to the people who were working on the psychology of flow. It was incredibly, incredibly balkanized. And most people, if they know about flow, they know about it from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and they know about the psychology. They have no idea that all this neurobiology has been done. And we wanted to first we wanted to get everybody on the same page, and we wanted to get all the researchers talking to one another. And then the goal was to advance flow state research. Now we're taking kind of a radical approach to it because our feeling is we want to open source it. This is ultimate human performance. Flow is the foundation of the best we can possibly be, and there are still a lot of puzzles out there. We've solved a lot, and my new book, Rise of Superman, covers a lot of that, but there's huge gaps in our knowledge. So my hope with Rise of Superman was I can get everybody on the same page. We can all start speaking the same language. But to us, this is human performance at its best. It should be everybody's project. So we wanted to create a platform that allowed us to kind of open source the research. We're also, on the side, building what we call flow dojos, which are giant flow performance training and research facilities.
Oh, my God. That's fantastic. Where do people find those facilities? And can
So
anybody...
we've only got a learning lab right now, and it's in Austin, Texas, but we're hoping to have one up and running probably early 2015. But, you can check back and forth with the Flow Genome Project, which is the organization. flowgenomeproject.co, C-O, is where you'll find us, and there's information there. There's actually a new, a little mini documentary that Andy Tiemener shot of us that has sketches and some of our really crazy equipment. Nothing like it in the world in the video, so you can check that out too, I think.
So now, is this something for folks listening? Is this something that anybody, the average Joe, myself, Josh,
Yeah, absolutely. So here's flow is very mistakenly associated with sports. Mm-hmm. And there are reasons for it, and they're good reasons, but when Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi did his original research, he discovered a couple of things that are really important. First of all, he started looking at experts. He was looking at neurosurgeons, rock climbers, ballet dancers, stock traders. Then he expanded his research out and started looking at everybody: Navajo sheep herders, Italian grape farmers, Japanese teenage motorcycle gang members, elderly Korean women, Detroit assembly line workers. He found two things that are important. One, everybody on Earth can access flow. It is ubiquitous. Second of all, he found that the happiest people on Earth are the people with the most flow in their lives. And what's important about this is the study he run, we would now call it a global happiness study. It's the largest one that's ever been run. So the largest happiness study we've ever conducted found the happiest people on Earth, the people who have the most life satisfaction, are the people with the most flow in their lives.
I need to figure out how to flow. So if there's a formula that I could just follow?
There is a formula that you can just follow, and I mean we can jump into action adventure sports if you want, because that's kind of a good gateway in.
Sure.
All right. So let's talk about the core thesis at the heart of Rise of Superman, because you kind of led with it, and it's worth kind of breaking out as an introduction into there. If you look at action adventure sports over the past 25 years, you see something absolutely astounding. You see nearly exponential growth in ultimate human performance, which is performance when life or limb is on the line. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Sports performance is governed by evolution. It's slow, it's steady. You plot it on a graph, you get a linear curve. You don't get an exponential curve. At no point in history does athletic performance quintuple in a decade. But if you look at action sports, let's take surfing. Here is a sport that is 1,000 years old. From basically 400 AD to 1996, the biggest wave anybody ever surfs is 25 feet. today we're pushing into 100 feet. If you look at snowboarding into the early 90s, right, the biggest thing anybody had ever jumped was the Baker Road Gap, which is 40 feet end to end. I was just talking to Travis Rice a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about clearing things that he didn't measure, but he thinks there's somewhere between 220 and 240 in length. And this is, you're talking over 15 years. Nothing like this has ever happened before. So the question at the heart of Rise is, the hell is going on? And the answer is action adventure sport athletes, for reasons that we're going to get to in a half a second, have become the best flow hackers in the history of the world. They're getting into flow more frequently and more deeply than probably any group of people in history. And there are reasons for this. And the reasons are this. Flow states have triggers. These are preconditions that lead to more flow. There are, depending on how you're counting, between 15 and 17 of them that we now know of. There are 3 environmental triggers, 3 psychological triggers, 1 creative trigger, 10 social triggers, or 7 social triggers, because 3 they overlap a little bit with the psychological triggers. And we can talk about a little bit more about what those are. But basically, action adventure sport athletes, inadvertently, it happened inadvertently, but they built their lives around these particular flow triggers, and they did it out of necessity, because at the upper edge of these sports, it is really flow or die. If you're not getting into flow states, you can't do the things these guys are doing. It's not possible. You're going to either end up in the hospital or dead. So necessity is the mother of invention, and they just kind of, felt their way into it. But what was great about it, because it's a subjective experience, it's always been very hard to do research, because how do you know if your subjects are in flow? We have qualitative, subjective measures, but they're not. They're good, and they're well validated, but they're not fantastic. But with today's action adventure sport athletes, we've got a lot of research that shows these guys are getting into flow all the time. So pretty much, if they're living through the experience, they're in flow, and it gives us a hard data set with which to work, which is great, which is one of the ways we could work backwards to some of these flow triggers.
Damn, I have so many questions for you. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I have Steven Kotler here talking about flow and how to harness your peak performance. Now, in The Rise of Superman, you profiled a handful of athletes and used them as case studies. I'm wondering how you chose those athletes.
It was tricky. And I actually get to talk about why there are not enough women in the book, also, and there are not enough women in the book, but this will answer the reason why. I was looking for paradigm shifts. I was looking for feats that were impossible, feats that people said were never going to be done. And so I wanted to use those as my case studies. I wanted to use, in the same way that, I think of Rise of Superman sort of like a Malcolm Gladwell book, but instead of like business case studies or society case studies, I've got action adventure sport athletes, and hopefully I've got better science, but I didn't say that out loud.
Oh.
But that, you asked me a question and I lost the thread.
No, it was about how you chose those athletes, and then you were kind of talking about it.
So I mean, which was what made it difficult with women is there's no Title IX for action sports. So I mean, and it's a problem, right? If you go, most of this stuff developed in the innovation incubator known as the ski town, right? And if the ratio in ski towns are 10-1, 10 guys for every woman, and there's no Title IX, so the women are about a generation behind the men. And so if you're looking for who's going to be doing impossible feats, you're going to get more men than women. I just had to get that out there.
Yep.
Which is not to say there aren't women in the book. There are, but there are more men than women. But I was looking for representatives from each sport and that I could find. There's some sports that got left on the cutting room floor. Mountain biking. I'm a big downhill mountain biker. It's one of my favorite things. I spent more time researching downhill mountain biking for Rise than anything else. Traveled all over the place for it. None of it's in the book. So some of it ended up on the cutting room floor. But I was looking for a variety of sports. I was looking for paradigm shifting breakthroughs. I was looking for athletes. One of the things I've found consistently with athletes is you can go very, very far in action sports on athleticism and courage. So most people don't start playing the mental game until they get to their 30s. Basically, most of the athletes I talked to said it was injury that put them into the mental game. So a lot of the people I talked to were 30 and above because they've gotten so much better at flow hacking and they can kind of speak to it very eloquently.
Right. Now, you had mentioned Malcolm Gladwell, and actually one of my questions was, is there any correlation to the Outliers principle? If hearing everything that I have about flow and everything that I understand about the Outliers principle, I feel like someone like myself would be basically screwed unless I've mastered or begun to flow in any which direction. I mean, at this point, I'm just a regular Joe.
Well, Malcolm's first of all, he's a phenomenal writer, and he's a really, really smart guy. But there are certain things, for example, 10,000 hours to mastery. Flow shortens the path to mastery.
Oh.
So let's talk a little bit about what causes flow, and then we can explain it from there.
Sure.
One of the things that causes flow is a cascade of 5 of the most potent neurochemicals the brain can produce. And a quick shorthand for learning and memory is the more neurochemicals you get, the greater chance an experience moves from short-term memory into long-term storage. Flow, these 5 chemicals show up in no other state. They're literally the 5 most potent chemicals the brain is producing, and they only show up in flow. So flow massively amplifies learning and memory, and we have statistics. We have numbers on this. We've got studies run everywhere from like brick and mortar schools through electronic learning environments, any environment you can imagine. But the study I'll reference is a study performed by DARPA, the government, the military, on snipers. They induced flow artificially, and I won't go into how they did this, but they induced flow artificially, sort of through brain science, and trained snipers up in flow. And they found target acquisition skills were amplified by 230%. In a different study run with non-military snipers, by artificially inducing flow, they cut the time it took to train a novice sniper up to the expert level by 50%. So flow accelerates the path to mastery.
Okay.
It also throws a bunch of other wrenches in it. So there are, for certain, the people who are best in the world at hacking flow fall under the Outliers principle, I would say. But, it's available to anybody. And I really mean everybody. McKinsey, the Business Quarterly, did a 10-year study of top executives. They found top executives are 5 times more productive in flow than out of flow. It is literally, this is fundamental to business, it's fundamental to relationships, it's fundamental to athletics, it's fundamental to pretty much anything you want to do.
Have you seen, are there flow consultants now that you work with business professionals or, in any of these different facets?
I think besides the work we do at the Flow Genome Project, because we do flow to impact training programs, there's probably nobody who's directly focused on it. That said, Dr. Mike Gervais, who is a high-performance psychologist who's on our board, is also the high-performance psychologist to the Seattle Seahawks, who just won the Super Bowl, and he teaches a whole bunch of stuff that, ranges from kind of mindfulness training, meditation and stuff, all the way up through flow work. So there are people who have incorporated this stuff into their training, and, the Seahawks did win the Super Bowl, so obviously to good effect. But I do think, as far as I know, we're the only people who are going straight at it. And one of the main reasons, by the way, is because RISE, I believe, is the first place all of the science has been written down in one place at one time. So I think, right now we're the only guys in here, but I think that's going to change in 3 weeks when the book comes out.
That's what I was wondering, what's next for the science of flow, and where do you see it going in the future?
Well, so let me tell you about what we know and what we don't know. We have a really good picture of the psychology. That was sort of laid down in the 60s and 70s and has been exceptionally well validated and expanded up till now. We've got a really good feel for the psychology. Starting in the early 90s, because of a technological revolution in brain science and because of the decade of the brain, Bush Sr. threw money at neuroscience and huge revolution occurred. And as a result, we can now peer deeper into the brain than ever before. So for the past 20 years, we have started to map the neurobiology of flow. What we have started to look at it, but don't really know, is the physiology of flow. So, for example, there's a lot of research that points to testosterone as playing a very important role in flow, but we don't know for sure. We know that cortisol is involved on the front end of a flow state, and Herb Benson at Harvard did some of the work, but he was working with very specific patient population, very specific circumstances. So we don't know something as very simple as your basic stress hormone, what are the levels before flow and after flow in a wide patient population. So the goal of the Flow Genome Project at a nitty-gritty level is to map the psychology onto the neurobiology, onto the physiology. And hopefully, doing it as a giant kind of open-sourced research project, and everybody can be involved in this. But that's kind of the goal, because the goal, what we think is when we're done mapping it, we don't think we're going to have like map coordinates. We think we're going to have a heat map for flow, like a general vicinity. But why that's so important is there are tons of on-ramps into flow. You can ride kind of risk and adventure and action sports into flow. You can ride endurance sports. Pain and exhaustion can take you into flow. Creatives, any creative act can take you into flow. Playing a video game can take you into play. Coding, writing code for computers, doing circuit design, network design, really anything that built Silicon Valley requires a lot of flow. Entrepreneurship triggers a lot of flow. There's an altruism-based flow state known as helper's high. We figure by having this heat map, we can kind of locate you where you are on this heat map and figure out exactly what your triggers are and how to get individuals into flow. We know some of this, and we do some of this work. And there's, I'll give you a simple example. We're running I don't know when you're going to post this, but starting on the 18th, RiseOfSuperman.com, we're running a big pre-sale campaign for Rise with lots of cool rewards. One of the rewards, just if you buy one copy of the book, is a flow state diagnostic, which is a test we've developed, very, very, very simple, but all it does is it's a basic psychological profile that maps what your flow triggers might be and puts you into one of four categories for which activities you might want to seek out to find more flow in your life.
I cannot wait to take that test. Oh, man. I guess my question, I wanted to jump back real quick. In regards to the snipers that you were talking about, I'm just curious, and I'm sure other people were wondering, was it drug,
No, it wasn't. Okay, so I guess we'll go into it. So we talked a little about neurochemistry, right? Mm-hmm. Another thing that happens in flow is there's a change in neural anatomy, which is where in the brain things are taking place. So if you want to map the neurobiology, when I say neurobiology, what I really mean is neurochemistry and neuroelectricity, which are the two ways the brain talks to each other, and neuroanatomy, which is where in the brain something happens. So flow is caused by what is known as transient, meaning temporary, hypo, H-Y-P-O, which means to slow down. It's the opposite of hyper. Frontality. Frontality is short for the prefrontal cortex, which is the front portion of your brain right behind your forehead, which is where all the things that you think of as you, that's where it lives. The prefrontal cortex is where your sense of will is, your morality lives. It's where you add very heavy complexity to problem solving. It's where all the executive functions are housed. So in flow, this portion of the brain is actually shutting down. The brain is performing an efficiency exchange. The brain has a fixed energy budget, so when focus narrows down and your need for energy going towards attention goes up precipitously, your conscious mind shuts off and your subconscious takes over. Your subconscious is much, much, much faster and much more energy efficient than your conscious mind, which is why one of the reasons flow feels so flowy. But a huge portion of your prefrontal cortex shuts down in flow. So let me talk a second more about this, and then I'll explain what they did to artificially induce flow. One of the reasons, for example, your sense of self goes away is because a part of your brain known as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and no, I won't make you say that,
Thank you.
Shuts down. That is your inner critic. That is that nagging, fearful, scared voice that is always kind of making you hesitate, goes away completely. So that's why people in flow talk about it as liberation. Travis Rice in one of our flow videos says flow is actually where everything makes sense. It's because the part of the brain that makes everything really messy and complicated, it's offline. It's not there. One of the reasons creativity is so heightened in flow is because your inner critic is shut down, so you're not judging your ideas super harshly. It also allows you to move from idea to idea or action to action. It's why flow feels flowy. Why does time get strange in flow states? Because time is calculated all over the prefrontal cortex. Once it starts to shut down, you can no longer separate past from present from future, so you're plunged into what psychologists call the elongated now. So now that we've got that out of the way, what they did is they basically used a giant electromagnetic pulse zapped it into the prefrontal cortex, and just took the whole thing offline. That's what they did. That was one experiment. The other experiment, they used neurofeedback, which is basically biofeedback, but it's neurofeedback, and they were instead of knocking out the prefrontal cortex, they were targeting flow neuroelectrically. Flow sort of hovers on the border between alpha and theta. So beta is kind of waking consciousness. When we're in beta, we're awake. We're talking. You and I are in beta right now. If we were to feel more of it, there's a very fast-moving wave that shows up when you're feeling a lot of fear. Below that is alpha. This is sort of daydreaming, free-flowing ideas. Below that is theta, which is the only time you're in theta is right as you're falling asleep or when you're dreaming. So that hypnagogic state right when you're falling asleep and ideas are kind of linking together in wild ways, that's theta. So flow exists on the border between alpha and theta. You can, using neurofeedback, you can very easily train people to zero in on this particular brainwave, and that's what they were doing. The important thing is this. This is where it gets really cool. We have not yet figured out how to do all this at once, right? So we don't know how to trigger the right neurochemistry, neuroelectricity, and neuroanatomical changes to produce flow. We usually, all the things that do it artificially or all the things that we worked on, pick one variable to move towards. So they got a 230 to 500% boost in learning in sort of like a low-grade partial flow state. Wasn't the full experience at all. So we really don't know that much what the upper end could look like, but unless you look at action sports and see that there's been nearly exponential growth in ultimate human performance, it's probably the only time you can actually see what's really possible when a lot of people start getting into a flow state. Though I will say, and in the book I interview a guy named Rhys Jones, who's one of the founders of the internet. He invented the blue wire that's in your telephone that carries the DSL signal. So he's been around the high-tech revolution from the beginning. And one of the things Rhys said to me is, if you look at the foundation of Silicon Valley, network design, circuit design, and software design are the three things that built the valley. You can't do any of them well without flow. So if you're looking for a non-sport example of what happens when a lot of people start getting into a flow state frequently, Silicon Valley is not a bad place to start.
Interesting. I got to tell you, my mind is blown right now, and I'm just going to say, are you flowing right now? The way that you are going through this and you know this information and you can just, it's flowing.
I have spent 15 years trying to figure out how to tell people this. I wrote a book called West of Jesus years ago that was about the Lyme disease experiences. It's kind of the birth of this research. You can, go read it. When I was done with West, they wanted me to write this book. And it has taken me it was taken me a decade to figure out how to talk about it this way and to get all the science on the same page. So I'm maybe flowing right now, but what you're really looking at is 10 years of practice.
Got it. Man, so talking about your book that's coming out this March, Rise of Superman, maybe you can tell people just a little what to expect. I'm hoping you unpack a lot of the stuff that you just talked about, but more in depth. But
yeah, everything we do. So it's a 3-part book, and it's pretty straightforward. The first part, and I remember, we're using action adventure sport athletes and impossible feats kind of as our case studies. So that shows up throughout. But the first third of the book peels back the neurobiology. So everything I've been talking about in much more detail.
All the geeky stuff.
And by the way, book is really, really, really fun to read. Not gonna bog you down. There's a lot of science in there. My mother told me it was the most of my books. She calls it the most readable. So that's all I'm saying.
Awesome. Okay.
The middle third is about flow triggers. It's about the 15 triggers that we can use to get more flow in our lives. And the final third is a look into the future and what's possible in society if we start getting more flow in our lives.
Okay. So when and where can people get this book?
March 4th, it drops, and you can pretty much anywhere online. You can't go into Barnes & Noble, sadly, because I partnered with New Harvest, which is Amazon's hardback publishing arm, and Barnes & Noble is mad at Amazon, and they won't carry my book. Sorry. But you can get it from Barnes & Noble online, but pretty much, online. You can go to, www.riseofsuperman.com and pre-order there.
Okay.
And as I said, if you wait to the 15th to pre-order, crazy fun reward campaign that we're running, and lots of neat stuff to give away.
Awesome, Steven. I could talk to you for hours. In fact, I hope I get to gain your audience again sometime soon. But thank you so much for joining me and geeking out on the show today about flow.
Molly, thank you so much, and I'm happy to come back whenever you want me.
Awesome. Again, I'm Molly Hawkins with today's guest, Steven Kotler. Thank you guys for listening. Visit outliersproject.com for more on Steven, flow, and make sure to be on the lookout for The Rise of Superman in March. See you guys next time.